This is a bull market presentation. So this is literally just meant to be a meme slide. DAOs are pretty cool. I think we're all interested in the sort of like way that DAOs operate, but I want to take a step back and sort of just ask the question, what are DAOs? So a little bit of background on myself. I'm Scott. I helped co-found Gitcoin with Owaki back in 2017. So far, we funded a lot of Ethereum public goods, but we've increasingly been focused beyond just Ethereum. So we've been looking at funding things like climate, diversity initiatives, scientific initiatives, and eventually we hope we can keep sort of allowing communities to fund their own shared needs as well. I'm also a steward for a number of related DAOs, so ENS, No Safe Optimism, and have done a bunch of work beyond that with DAOs like Pleaser DAO and Seed Club, and the list of things that I've sort of participated in the past. But when I think about what Gitcoin's sort of been up to over the past few years, I think in the context of what we're calling sort of DAOs here, we can refer to Gitcoin as a mechanism to fund or kind of like create internet native communities. And what I mean by that is we have these sort of mechanisms to create things like roads and subway systems and electrical grids and Web 2, but we don't really have equivalent mechanisms for funding open source software, which is kind of what creates all the positive externalities, benefits for us in this ecosystem in Web 3. And so we need these goods to kind of be funded according to communities' interests. And we need to basically figure out ways to empower communities to fund things that end up being, generative to their communities, but also generative to the broader Web3, and eventually, hopefully, broader, even physical sort of nation state level communities. Although that's a different discussion with a lot of contention around it in terms of what we call eventual sort of digital nations or digital states. The mechanisms that we currently use on the Gitcoin side to do this are things like quadratic funding, which I won't dive super deep on here, but TLDR, it's a democratic way to do something called participatory grants making. So having individuals in a community participate in the allocation of funds according to their preferences versus the preferences of a larger institution. And of course, we've done this with a number of DAOs in the space already in terms of working to help them understand their own shared needs and then fund those using QF in particular. So that's what Gitcoin is. That's a little bit about what I've done. Try and skip ahead from that into the broader conversation, which is just what are we talking about here? Like, what are DAOs? And I'm making this up. I think we're all kind of making this up as we go, because no one really has a good fundamental model of governance, because governance is a human thing. We're all basically people trying to come together to form sort of organizations that control some decision-making process in order to hopefully carry out some kind of eventual objective. The autonomous part here is actually the particularly controversial part, because generally speaking, DAOs are not autonomous. But if you go back to the 2016, 2015 history of this, a lot of early conversations around DAOs really emphasized the autonomy. And what they meant by that was very much the code is law. Smart contracts are, people kind of arguments where essentially these pieces of code will just run and operate everything for us. I think one of the biggest things we realized in the last, especially 3-4 years, is that's not really the case. But we do still have, and we still do have decentralization in the context of these organizations that we're trying to create. And I would argue what we mean by autonomy now is more so, how do we give people the agency and authority to work on things that matter to them in the context of these groups so that they can basically be kind of productive, but still autonomous and have control and agency over themselves versus, what might typically take place in a more hierarchical organization, although we'll get to the pros and cons of hierarchy as well. So to go even one level more abstract, we've got a lot of different models that are floating around. One of these is from the Talix blog post. One of these is actually just from I believe actually someone who's been in this group's blog post. And I think this is all already familiar to this group, so I'm not going to dwell on these sort of theoretical terms. But in short, we want these to, in ideal form, be very grassroots, very open, transparent, ideally global. And this gets even more abstract as we start to go to what are these different sort of previous historical framings of organizations that we use to define the ways we coordinate. Those are things like companies, they're things like cooperatives, which is what that second one is. It's probably the least clear. Those are things like states, those are things like organisms, those are things like games. And I think honestly, like a lot of the theory of those, all the way back to the first slide, is likely to get us more confused than not. And so what I want to kind of ground this in is, what are DAOs actually doing today? What are we really using, practically speaking? So we're using Telegram. We're using like Gnosis Safe. That's like a very simple example of a, group chat multi-sig type DAO. Whether that is a DAO is still also in question. And then more practically, a lot of larger DAOs today tend to use, a process of basically on-chain voting. So what I mean by on-chain voting in this case is that there is actually a treasury which is governed by a set of participants, and those participants go through a kind of vote checking process using often something off-chain like Snapshot, and they'll basically decide through that process whether to push something to a ratifying vote on-chain, and that will be executed by the contracts themselves. And then over time, those contracts are upgraded. For example, Governor Alpha being upgraded to Governor Bravo in the compound context. And then on the sort of Web 2.5 side, these DAOs still use a lot of the same sort of tooling, Discord, Discourse, Notion, a lot of tools that help people coordinate information, but are still fundamentally sort of centralized. They're, in the sort of edge case and in the long run, aimed at creating more decentralization, but still they're kind of centralized right now. And so this means that DAOs are really messy because you have a lot of different systems. Some of these are Web3 systems, some of these are Web2 systems. And you have a lot of people sort of with different conceptions of what the DAO is or how the DAO would operate. And so I want to sort of just really simplify this and focus on one particular term in this slide, which is internet native, and say that DAOs are just a group of people with a shared purpose deciding to distribute resources according to some common goal, which is really what any organization is trying to do at the end of the day. But the difference between DAOs and other organizations is that this is happening in an internet native fashion. So in practice, that just means that ideally the organization was created online, it operates online. Most of the even financial activity in the context of on-chain, which has become a really popular term, is operated online. And I think fundamentally, this is what separates DAOs from other organizations and what makes the innovations in governance interesting, because all these sort of experiments are happening in a different realm from what you might do in the Federal Reserve or what you might do in a traditional municipal government meeting. But I think the premises can be the same. The question is, what does the internet nativeness add to the way that these sort of organizations or governance can typically function? And so, I'll skip through sort of like people, product, purpose as three ways that we sort of view the sort of like things that DAOs need to, or any organization kind of needs to like be effective. This is going to depend basically on the organization's scale. So you can go from even individuals, just like with, for example, sole proprietors in traditional everyday sort of real world context, to large scale Discord communities that are entirely online. There's a wide range of types of communities, which are just people, and the types of community will dictate in part the type of governance. And in fact, the scale of community will also dictate the type of governance, because when you have things like squads, you can have very informal, fluid ways of making decisions. And even with things like the IETFs or the Internet Engineering Task Force, you have a lot of governance by consensus. So you don't have people voting, you just have people kind of going through a very fluid process of making decisions. And when you get to larger scales, this gets hard because it's very difficult to get through most of the decisions you need to make in a timely manner with just consensus, where any objection needs to be voiced and needs to be addressed. So instead, you end up actually with a worse system, slightly worse system. This is a also controversial take, which involves this thing called voting. And voting is a last mile decision-making mechanism, which is necessary in order to come to some final decision, but is fundamentally the antithesis of culture and purpose, in the sense that you ideally want people to kind of find alignment quickly, find an adventure worth going on, kind of go through this hero's journey, build alignment, rally each other, find really exciting things that they want to do in a relatively like high vibe way, and then flow towards those pretty organically. But voting creates a bottleneck to this culture and sort of approach to governance. But what you basically get in turn is a much easier way to manage like a larger product or larger series of tools that otherwise would be, potentially very hard to structure, to distribute funds to in a sustainable, consistent way. Basically, you're de-risking and you're ossifying in the process of de-risking. And that's a trade-off space that you just have to deal with as organizations scale, even in the context of DAOs. So basically, just the last sort of piece here is just, everyone is sort of producing something. People talk about products as software, but I just want to also clarify that like these can be chronicles of events, these can be maps of some territories, can be things like the Whole Earth catalog, which is what Stuart Brand was kind of up to here. And, these are ultimately things that get harder to do really well as organizations unless you have very, very sort of tight processes in place. But at the same time, things like Goodhart's Law can occur. So Goodhart's Law just being this sort of overfitting that occurs when you assign really specific metrics or measures to things and end up in the process sort of chasing a metric that may not actually map precisely to the outcome that you want to achieve. There's this constant tension of you can't, when you're 1,000 people run like you're a startup or like you're a group of friends just kind of hanging out, but you also need to be careful not to chase metrics off a cliff. And these are some of the trade-offs that you basically run into, not just with DAOs, but with any organization. And so, basically, you have things like the group chat, which are mirrored in things like Constitution DAO. You have things like Occupy Wall Street, which are mirrored in things like, for example, FWB in the context of what they want to achieve in terms of building culture. You have things like the Federal Reserve, which are kind of being mirrored with things like MakerDAO, although, maybe the Federal Reserve could become just a Discord chat one. And then you even have things like, basically McDonald's that are just other types of organizations which have certain governance processes and have certain internal structures and have basically a sort of production line product. The product isn't necessarily the food itself, it's the production mechanism, which is sort of what you have with things like Uniswap or other protocols in the online context, or things like ENS. So there's lots of mechanisms we can experiment with. And the question that I have for folks here is basically, because I wanted to try and get through this quickly, so there's probably going to be a lot of questions, but is how do we actually leverage this internet nativeness that we're sort of talking about to better iterate on these different ideas of, previous Web 2 or even like pre-web organizations, and basically make sure that we're not just, mirroring those in Web 3 organizations and still converge on some new model of governance that is, functional for large groups or for their relevant group size up to like a group size of N. And how do we basically make sure that these are consistent and, I guess, well-established models that anyone can draw from? So I have more questions than answers from this, which is sort of why I put it together originally. I was just like kind of trying to answer the question of what are we talking about when we're talking about DAOs? And I think, basically getting involved in a DAO is one way to do this. I feel like I've learned a lot just from being involved in DAOs, but I would still love to now actually dive into what Sean's kind of talking about in terms of how do we actually think about best practices today, and how do we basically leverage this on-chain internet native nature versus sort of push it away even as groups scale. So I'm happy to start anywhere there. This is the much larger question / presentation of the two.
So my question is that what I found and what I've been really thinking about is that if we define DAOs by the existing states of which you've kind of described, like the protocols, for example, their main objective really is to sustain themselves with capital. So token go up, for example. If a social DAO, maybe it is like for social impact. And how we defined businesses like nonprofit, not-for-profits, social enterprises, there has been pushback on defining DAOs. But I feel that if we define DAOs, then we can build better governance systems. That is to say that we can find commonalities like you just used for like McDonald's or Wendy's or, corporate, that we can build upon that already exists. Because like, yes, we're still new, the space is still new, but the foundations of coordination, organizational structures, governance isn't necessarily new. And so do you think that by defining it with also a little bit of agility of movable allows people who are at least creating DAO kind of a pathway as to like, what are the checks and balances needed and like, what is the role of governance?
Yeah, I think, so one thing that I want to like be sure on is I actually think DAOs can have many definitions. Like I'm kind of making fun of the idea in the early part of this deck that like there's many different people saying DAOs are, DAOs are like a bird, or DAOs are like a, swarm of bees. And it's like, okay, but like, let's be precise about what we're talking about. But I also do think that there's lots of different ways of thinking about an organization, and there's lots of different structures that we can use to fulfill different objectives. So in cooperatives, like the objective is very much more social stewardship of a given kind of area, like for example, a property, or a stewardship of a business even. And it's just based on this sort of Rochdale set of principles of equity and sort of equal ownership and participation. That alone has like a rich history that I think can be leveraged for people in Web3 to think about. Probably controversially, I also think, again, like companies are not terrible in terms of, there's a good history of corporate governance all the way back to sort of the creation of the firm that with like Ronald Coase, I believe, that like is really useful to defining best practices and structures. And I guess like what I want us to think about is like really three parts of the definition, the very simplified definition I was giving. What is the common objective? Like, what is the thing everyone's trying to do? How are resources being allocated, if there are resources towards, even in a non sort of like capitalist like framing or like mutualist framing, I still think some kind of resource management is useful, and it is something that like David Graeber talks about in less sort of like capitalist terms pretty well. But then basically what I'm most interested in is this like still the internet native part, because if we can only, so an example of this, like to be more concrete, would be a company traditionally has to ratify or update bylaws for their directors on a board with an in-person meeting that like has to have certain conditions met. What does the equivalent of that process look like for upgrading a smart contract in the context of like a compound governor alpha DAO? It might look exactly the same, where it's just like actually people, instead of meeting in a physical room, need to meet on Discord, or we skip the synchronous part of this entirely and just people need to do a vote together. But I think the interesting part to me is like, how can we use these tools so that these organizations are actually fundamentally better than previous ones? Because otherwise DAOs are just organizations, right? And which is also okay, but it doesn't make it quite as exciting. So I guess like I'm kind of going on tangents here, but to me, I would just love us to understand, like, I would love us to sort of like think when we're talking about what is good governance, not just what is good corporate governance or what is good cooperative governance, or, what can we learn from natural biological systems, but also what is new, like what is like novel in this structure.
Yeah, actually, it's an interesting take. And please correct me if I don't understand correctly, but if I understand correctly, we are saying like we are limiting DAOs kind of like to like corporates. So like we say like, here is the corporates, and now we are recreating it in the digital native kind of way. But we should not limit ourselves just like to the corporate structure, but there can be other structures we are replacing by the DAO. Is that kind of correct?
So there's two models. There's the model of we are replacing a Web 2 / like traditional structure with we're upgrading it in some way. Like we're making, for example, the voting process for a cooperative to add a new member much more streamlined, or we're changing like that way that boards will ratify new bylaws or amendments. But I think there's also just this question of like, those are things that can happen both ways. It's just faster. Like it's like slightly more efficient when it happens in an internet native organization. But what are things that couldn't happen otherwise? Like what are things that like, and an example of this to me would be something more akin to, as much as I actually don't really like the example, like something akin to the building a global movement like FWB, Occupy Wall piece of this, because that movement didn't really have a way to coordinate value across everyone who was interested in it and interested in the objectives of it. It actually had a very hard time creating and even solidifying those objectives amongst very fragmented local groups that had very different ideas of what they wanted to achieve. And it certainly didn't have any kind of shared currency or like even, not that it necessarily should, but like upside or like way of allowing people who are participating to sustain themselves through this movement. So to me, like that's a good example of, and that's going back to like that sort of first slide on like, what are the different characteristics we often think about with DAOs, transparency, global access. Those are the types of cases that I'm very interested in. And so, maybe one question is like, is it just that we can apply like corporate or cooperative governance structures to those kinds of movements, or is there a new kind of governance structure we should be considering? And if so, what does that look like? So the first piece for me is, what is a novel type of organization that would be hard to do without basically this sort of structure or without internet access and sort of a native currency in some fashion? And then two, do we need new governance structures, or should we just be looking back historically, and when should we do one or the other? Basically, like, again, these are questions I don't actually have answers to, but I would love to see us kind of almost create an index or catalog of some of these different models, and then map them in this way to new types of organizations.
Really impressive presentation. I feel here, let me turn on my video because it's really cool. I feel like seen in some regards. This is the way you're thinking about this is it mirrors where I get to on some of this stuff. I think that ultimately natural processes are I think nature does a bit of a better job of getting to the solutions. And there's like a billion plus year head start on mechanism design. And everything that hasn't made it is the space that all the mechanisms that have get to move through. Like that's basically kind of where I land. I think DAOs are going to be the same way. Like I think like when better mechanism design starts to work its way into DAO craft and token design, I think these V1 DAOs just get their faces ripped off. And not like, again, it's the best we have right now. Hopefully there's like a good transition in there. But all that to say, the call out for a better model, I've like felt this in my bones. I think that the way we like governance process design is just terrible. And I've kind of started to think about this as like liquidity of my ability to select my representative, liquidity of my ability to get involved at any point, right? To say, no, that's no longer where I want to abdicate to. And then where the ask for like, what's different now, I think lightning fast accounting. So I think that that might be it. Like, to be quite honest, I think what we've done with that is basically say like, we kind of like our slow methods, right? Like we normally elect our representatives every 2 years, 4 years, or 6 years. DAOs, we've gotten that down to like 3 months, right? That's kind of, and we still have like one, we pass around voting capital very similarly, right? Like it could be slips of paper if it wasn't an entire planet playing the game. I think all that just to say, all the things that we kind of do after the vote casting, right? In terms of counting, I think is the act of like cultural legitimization in a way. And how do I put it? I think by taking a look at those 3 dimensions of vote, portability, and accountability, of liquidity of representational choice, and liquidity of participatory choice, I think you basically set the not entire, but like that you've now set the race, right? If you put a stake in the ground at like, this is complete freedom among these 3 dimensions is the ideal. And then you constrain backwards from there, like as like almost like a seed crystal of democratic choice. That implementation, that fully unconstrained implementation, isn't technically impossible right now, right? You could have a fully on-chain DAO that has propose, decide, execute baked in a really unconstrained way. And then you could self-govern your way down to a set of rules that's best for your community, right? That's kind of how I think of it. But anyway, I just kind of thrown it out there because I put some of these ideas roughly. I wrote some of them down, but just to say, like, this has been like a really impressive survey of like all of it. I'm kind of blown away. So I guess if there's a question in there, I guess it would kind of be one of the things in your model, like purpose, culture, because I think, let's say there is a 99.99% step change improvement in the speed to which we can determine the constituency, right, of a, the common sense. Culture, maybe just goes away in the way we think of it. That process of like, hey, how do you guys feel about, okay, cool. Like, how do you guys feel? Okay, cool. Like you get that sort of like, oh my God, I'm not right about that. Or maybe we don't want to move in that direction, but there's no conversation to it. It's just, the sense of it. There's one word you used here in purpose and culture, atonement. Can you kind of just expand on like in the process of how culture around decision making, like how you're thinking about that? Because I think it is an important element that I guess it's like fear would be the word that I use. If we start the time to decision becomes very fast among humans, are we moving in the right direction? Isn't quite as much of that conversation, I guess, is the issue.
Yeah. So I think that on the one hand, I definitely agree with you that there's a constrained space that we're like operating in. And I guess like one of the key points of this is kind of not to give an answer, but to say there's actually a lot of different models that like will work well for different contexts. So like there won't be, which I think is what you're saying too, there won't be one model that just is like the governance optimal approach. And I think we've all seen this already with historical governance models. Like there's many different approaches that work for many different group sizes, very different cultures. And so ultimately we just need to like have a really fast way of like, to your point, figuring out like who are the constituents. To go to your point about attunement, it's like what is the culture and how attuned are people to that, and then how quickly can you map that to some kind of model that allows them to make decisions very quickly. Because for some groups, like an easy example on this would just be like, imagine, like if you went by like psychological traits, you had a very high disagreement group. Doesn't really matter anything else about the group. Just if they're high disagreement, it's going to be very difficult to do a consensus-based approach to governance. And when groups scale, they tend to just naturally become higher disagreement because there's more opinions. Those opinions are mapped out like on a whatever normal distribution. You have like different people with different views. But even in a small group, if you had like 10 people and they were all just like, they might even like have similar opinions, but they have strong or high disagreement, that model would still like be terrible. Anything regarding like consensus versus voting would not work very well. So and that's what I mean by sort of attunement is just like how deeply do people all align on the same principles in the context, some given objective, some given problem space, some given movement. And there's also some stuff to get into here about like the higher level the principles are, the easier it is for people to like be like, yes, like that's one thing I think that's worked really well with Gitcoin is like, I do think everyone genuinely wants to fund public goods. Like people want to do good for the world. It gets harder when you're like, well, wait, like what kinds of public goods? What are we talking about? Like where are the different moving parts of, funding this local community versus funding this local community, whether that's like, funding, open source software versus funding climate, like you start to get lines drawn. And that's when you need like more voting, more formal processes. And if you have high attunement, you kind of by definition get legitimacy. You like get like a genuine sense of like, if we are all following the principles that like we align on, then things are going to work. Like we're happy with any outcome. And so when you get those votes of, open source gets funded more than climate, people are still okay with that. People are willing to concede to the legitimacy of the system. So I guess this is all to say, like, yeah, you really want to like know, yeah, like, and I think you're right. Like you want to and can know more quickly who your constituents are and have like a good mapping of like what they care about. You can more quickly attune them to a given sort of set of ideas because information distribution online is just probably sometimes way too fast, but like much faster. And then you also have, the ability to then distribute value pretty much instantly based on that. So there's no like second guessing of like, oh, well, wait, let's revisit this. It can just happen relatively instantaneously. In theory, in practice, there's still stuff that doesn't always work like that. But I think you're absolutely right that there's a real benefit to just like faster accounting / like faster movement of funds, and then a real benefit to like sort of faster cultural alignment. I'll pause there because I'll just keep rambling otherwise. This is why this is a harder talk, because I'm like, I haven't even distilled exactly my takeaways from it.
I think one place I get to, kind of where to go from there. Like it's such a big heady thing, right? Like how do we humans optimize as maybe particles within a murmuration of humans, right? Like that's sort of the opportunity of DAOs. But I guess where it gets me a little bit is like nature just always does 50% plus one. I think is kind of at least the observation in a like a quorum sense. Whereas I do think we kind of like Ethereum now is 66%, right? To like validate a group endeavor, right? Every block, 66% instead of, that 50% mark. I think kind of once you have a defined set, like you can reparameterize, like maybe to the benefit of the coordinative whole. And I think maybe like, I don't know, like again, it's such a big heady topic, dude. And I feel like when we're talking about digital physical phenomenon, it's like I can a murmuration of humans, and like then that has to become code. That what is that? And I'm like, what are we even talking about at this point? But it is just wild, because I think what we're talking about is like the fabric of a species and how we move forward. So just really cool stuff. Thank you.
So I have kind of a hot take, is that in our current societies, the way that our democracy was built isn't appropriate for how our diversified societies are. So in DAOs, it could be like how they scale, how they reach a global audience. And like when you have a global community, the way that it was originally designed wasn't necessarily in their benefit. And why I was really interested in DAOs is that more on the technological aspect of things. I worked in nonprofit, and I understood the human condition, incentives, greed, corruption, and also just in the charity models where, you would donate money and it wouldn't necessarily go to the right people. And so I thought DAOs could fix that on a technological level, totally. Then we needed mass adoption, so we included more people. But we didn't really factor in the human condition, if you will, but also the legitimacy of those that could actually help design these systems outside of the technological aspects, not smart contracts, but like in processes. And so then my question is, and this is why it's been kind of difficult kind of engaging academics or people that actually work in corporate governance or people that work in public policy within DAOs, because the ways that we're doing it isn't really clear in terms of structure or legitimacy or transparency, if you will, when it comes to the human mobilization and voting and delegation and things like that. So I guess my question is, because you are at Gitcoin in a high position, obviously, like, why do you think that governance as a profession in the DAO ecosystem or governance design isn't necessarily taken as seriously?
I think the hard part is, and I'm guilty of this too, like I'm kind of doing this in some sense with this, like the presentation. I want to figure out a way to like map a lot of these different models to clear sort of like practical implementation details. And an example of that would be for voting, implementing something like ranked choice voting or quadratic voting, when you want to have a broader distribution of the population, like a democratic decision-making process, but then having, for example, something like a committee, even potentially private committee model, when you want specific expert opinion on things, and even getting people to know when they want both of those and to come to agreement on, or like each of those respectively, and when and how they will implement those, like, it's just very unclear to people. But one, I agree with you that like the existing democratic systems are not very effective. There's like arrows and possibility theorem, which is like basically just like first past the post systems, where you have like whoever's first past post wins tend to fall into having only two candidates or two parties. And then you have basically no real way out of that, because then when people try and create new parties, those parties just split the vote and it doesn't do anything. And that's like the US has, kind of ossified in terms of its political system, which is good in terms of, to some degree, stability, but then also at the same time can't really change according to like just the modern world, and also accrues like all this corruption debt, like this, like, people kind of like to make fun of the idea of like the deep state, but all that like really people are talking about is like bureaucratic state that is unelected, that actually ends up having a lot of authority over how decisions are made. So you have this one problem of like, this is a whole thing to get into, but like you have the one problem where like the US is just very, stuck in its ways, both because of how long the system has been around in this first past the post way, and then also how much under like kind of like the surface bureaucracy there is. But then you also have this problem of, there's no fork exit model for really creating new systems. There's no like, oh, well, actually, like we could just build our own like test case of a new US, democracy. And I think that fork and exit choice in Web3 makes it a lot easier, at least to kind of fix problems faster. Like that's like when we're talking about what is different about internet enabled organizations, like I think that's one thing that's like particularly useful. It's just that like you can ideally shut them down very quickly and you can ideally like change or fork them very quickly. But yeah, like for what we're doing on the, the Gitcoin side and other DAOs that I'm part of too, I think people are just defaulting to models that are very relatively like efficient to try, because one of the consequences of the space moving very quickly is that it has to get things done in a certain time frame, or like it just becomes irrelevant. This is a whole problem of like, organizations will sometimes even exist for like 3 months, let alone like 5 years in our case, and just like suddenly like people are just like, anyway, like we're done with that, we're going to do something else now. So I think people are just like, okay, how do we keep producing stuff that people care about? How do we keep putting stuff out into the world that matters? And I think that's maybe like one thing that we should think more carefully about is like, how do we, we have this coordination technology. How do we all like coordinate on the idea of basically slowing down a bit and maybe not always just using the next, Arbitrum Zero Drop is a good example of this recently, like exact same token distribution model that like 1 million people have done, very unequal in terms of like rewarding people that have actually like done a lot of work building on Arbitrum. And we have the same problem with people who are just repeating building on Governor Alpha, because like compound Governor Alpha is like safe, it's secure, we can like know that it's not going to get hacked. I would love to figure out like a set of standards around that. I know that like Josh Tan and the MetaGov folks are doing a really interesting kind of project on DAOstar, where they're trying to build like a grant standard. And that's something we've been talking to them about in terms of just like, how do we like model the different ways you could do grants in an ecosystem, whether participatory or like with the community or whether by committee, and how do you, or like directly, totally with like one person in control even. And then how do you model out when each of those would make sense, how you would actually allow people to just like know when funds are transferred to an address that it will be distributed according to those principles. And some of this goes back even to the what is autonomous conversation, like how do we make the smart contracts do a little bit more here, like more of the lifting. Those are some of the like sort of starting points for these conversations. But we built up a lot of momentum that's, especially in the bull market, moved very quickly towards just implementing what is available so we can stop worrying about the process and worry about the work, which I think is not always bad. Like you need to get the things done, but there's a proper balance of those things for sure.
Sorry, just gonna a little bit pushback. I wouldn't agree that we're moving much faster when it comes to governance. I think that at some points we're risk averse when it comes to especially like social DAOs, like
yes,
protocols, sure. I'm trying to figure out why that is so. And it's maybe because like the people who are in those social DAOs designing the governance systems are working on the technological aspect of things and not really looking at like the human behavior, social incentives part of things. Because I continuously hear that governance is everybody's responsibility, but we hear that in our democracy as well. Like we have redlining and we have obstacles for people to actually participate and education gaps and things like that. And so what kind of, piece of advice or examples have you seen on really onboarding regular community members in the governance process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that groups like, so like in ENS, like a lot of people who are part of working groups leading those efforts are people that were nominated by the community to sort of be part of that process because they saw them posting on Discord a lot or on Discourse a lot. And those people naturally then were able to participate and become part of those different committees, different working groups. But I mean, beyond that part of things, like beyond sort of like the representative democracy element of like just electing, kind of like bringing people on, I think it can be difficult to get like, yeah, like especially new people really engaged in that process. Part of this comes down to also like the complexity of the process. So one part of this is you need a way to onboard people very efficiently in DAOs. There isn't one. DAOs are like very messy in terms of onboarding. So naturally then like there's a sort of process by which people who have been there longer accrue more power and tend to have roles in like governance for longer. So like some solutions to this could just be like you have like term limits, like in traditional, like even the US system has those, and it's I think relatively effective. But then you also need to have some process by which like new members really like come to understand the flow of governance. Part of that is probably that we haven't really defined what an optimal flow of governance is, again, going back to kind of like the high level of this presentation. So we have like, on the one hand, new people coming in and not necessarily learning the process of governance that's there, but also wanting to change the process of governance. And that's currently not bad because the process of governance that they're using might not be the best process. But there's like probably a need to separate those two concerns. So if someone's new and coming in, they should really learn the existing governance process and like build up like expertise and like become part of that system. And then eventually influence in that system where they're doing something good for the organization. On the other hand, you probably want like ideally even external groups coming in and saying, we've analyzed these 20 DAOs and we think that like these parts of these models are like failing in these ways. And we want to see like these improvements. And here's like, by the way, like a way you could upgrade your Governor Alpha or Governor Bravo contract to actually implement those changes. Like that would be, I think, hugely successful because most of it is a question of one, people trying to manage this flow of people coming into the DAO while at the same time trying to manage the process changes being suggested by the people coming into the DAO. So you just get like, you either have to constrain the level of like chaos there, or the DAO just starts not focusing on the objective and you just lose all momentum. Obviously, again, there's that trade-off of like process versus the work. But then two, I think often people see that there are problems with an existing governance structure, but there's no real like capacity or internal will for that to like change. So I actually think working groups are like, they're an okay model. Like they're like not a terrible model, but like they're not a perfect model. And one of the challenges with working groups is even just like people end up, again, like you accrue kind of like a Lindy effect from just being a work stream for a long time. And then people don't want to ever wind down a work stream. It's the same thing with DAOs at large. Like no one ever shuts down a DAO. Like DAOs never shut down. They just kind of persist in a weird zombie state a lot of the time. You see this with token projects across Web3 too. And so I think that's like a problem just we have to resolve generally. But then I think secondarily, so that's like, anyway, like there's this problem of if someone could just come in and be like, we actually like have clear research across so many other DAOs that like these are common issues. And we know that if you implemented these fixes to the existing voting process, you would be able to like reduce these issues by X amount. I think as soon as you get one or two of the DAOs in that group to be like, all right, like, what do we have to do? And if that thing is easy, that's even better. Then you can get all the other 18 DAOs in that group to just like say, yes, like, let's do that. And you're in that process undoing this momentum effect of people just being like, I guess we're going to use, Compound, Governor Alpha because it's there. Or I guess we're going to use the same token distribution model again to go back to that. So I guess like, I think there's a lot of problems basically. Like, I guess to answer it, it's like, one of the things is separating concerns. So like really finding a group of governance experts and having them build the legitimacy to make the changes without disrupting the work in the DAO until those changes are really ready to be implemented. Kind of like when you make like a pull request or something, like you want to like know that that's ready to go. And then two, you want to like really try and do that across as many DAOs as possible, like as a single like kind of upgrade to the ecosystem, so that everyone's sort of on the same page and moving in sort of lockstep towards a better, like an objectively better model of governance. So, and what that model is, by the way, again, still no real, like, that's probably going to depend on like the size of the DAO, like, again, the attunement or culture of the DAO, all questions. Those are two things that at least I think are important to consider. And then Punkar, I saw you had your hand raised, and I want to make sure we get to you before we run out of time.
No worries. Like, I think we just run out of time. So I will just like put the statement, another question there. Like, that's why actually the DAO Governance Collective started, to really share knowledge about different governance structures, what other DAOs are doing, where they are succeeding, where they are failing, so we can evolve from there. one of the example which might have impacted your life actually was like, Sean brought up his proposal, which he made for Gitcoin, how to basically like take, like redo the vote if we all think something, but like we want to actually, we have actually changed our minds, like through the group, and like there was a lot of discussion about it and, some feedback towards it. And I hope it helped, but like this is something like definitely our group wants to achieve. We'll see how successful we will be. But I like what you said, because you are bullish on something like this and we are here, so that's good.
Yeah, and by the way, like I think in those, like if I'm remembering that proposal correctly, it was kind of like retro PGF, like for DAO contributors. I think that's like those are the types of proposals that I think are really interesting to me, in the sense that they're very low effort to try. They allow you to easily build like a group of contributors that feel value from the retroactive distribution, and it doesn't actually really disrupt the overall governance process. Like it basically can happen independently, but over time, if successful, can slowly allocate more and more capital relative to whatever the existing governance process is. So it's kind of a weird, like, it's not really a fork like sort of option, but it's like it's giving you like diversity of different distribution options that you can test against each other. But yeah, really great discussion. And thanks for having me.